Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are undertaking a truly immersive journey.
We really are.
We're using what seems like a quiet, remote corner of the English countryside to map, well, the entire scope of a writer's life.
And not just his life, but his ambition and his really painful reconciliation with reality.
Exactly. This is a deep dive into the reflective observations of V.S. Naipaul, focusing on his time spent in a valley in Wiltshire.
That's absolutely right. Our whole mission here is to analyze what happens when this profound cultural fantasy of a place, in this case England, collides with the gritty, constantly shifting, and often, deeply unsettling reality of actually living there.
We're exploring that tension in Wiltshire where you have this monumental history.
Right, we're talking ancient barrows and tumuli.
We're crashing headlong into the noise of industrial modernity and, of course, deeply personal memory.
And the starting point for all of this, for this whole collision, it isn't even in physical geography. It's rooted in an image.
Something abstract, something the writer carried with him from halfway across the world. It all begins with Salisbury.
It's just one of those beautiful foundational ironies. Naipaul, growing up in Trinidad, his first idea of what an English town even was, it came from a four-color reproduction.
Of a painting.
Of a Constable painting of Salisbury Cathedral. He saw it in his third standard reader, so he would have been, under 10?
Wow, so that's a stunning visual anchor for a place he'd never even been to.
Precisely. And he describes it as the most beautiful picture he had ever seen. So for him, Salisbury wasn't a real messy working city. It was an archetype of beauty, of permanence, of this sort of historical piece, all fixed forever in that one little picture.
So that sets up this powerful, decades-long tension between that beautiful abstract idea and the complex, messy physical space he eventually ends up living in.
Exactly.
So when he finally does arrive in the valley near Salisbury, decades after first seeing that image, he's not just nervous because he's a writer looking for solitude.
No, not at all.
He's nervous because he's about to put a fantasy that has sustained him his entire life to the test. He arrives, and he's just deeply aware of his own strangeness, my solitude.
Oh, that feeling of being an outsider was immense for him. He was nervous almost, clinically isolated. He even notes that he was glad there was no village to speak of, which suggests that being close to a genuine, established community felt like a threat to him.
Why do you think the initial social interaction was such a painful prospect for him?
Well, he describes any excursions into nearby towns as painful, and this is his phrase, like a tearing at an old scab.
It's visceral.
It is. He felt himself to be profoundly in the other man's country, and that sense of being constantly watched, of not belonging, it just made him retreat. But this isolation, this status he has as an external sensor, that's what allows for all the observations we're about to unpack.
Right. He isn't absorbed by the place. He's observing its mechanics from this self-imposed distance.
He's treating Wiltshire almost like an anthropological study of a decaying civilization.
Okay, so let's unpack the setting itself. Because the physical landscape of Wiltshire, near Salisbury, it's immediately paradoxical. It's the pastoral ideal, in theory.
Right.
But the sources reveal a place that's just defined by raw contradiction, a place where the earth itself is telling two different stories at once.
The land is truly dialectical. If you look at the high downs, they are, flinty and dry, whitish brown, whitish green. It gives you that sense of antiquity, of barren, untouched, chalky history.
Yeah, that old England feel.
But then you look down into the wide valley bottom where the farm operates, and the ground is muddy and black, perpetually churned and spoiled by modern tractor wheels and heavy machinery.
So it's a visual clash.
It's a clash between the eternal and the temporarily industrial.
And that contrast extends to the temporal scale, too.
Oh.
The area isn't just old, it's defined by the proximity of this monumental history. I mean, Stonehenge is right there, along with all these old barrows and tumuli.
Those ancient burial mounds, yeah. They're profound signs of human settlement stretching back millennia.
Yes, but that profound antiquity is immediately situated right next to the noise and the infrastructure of modern warfare and industry.
That's the key. When the narrator looks down from the downs, he's not just seeing an untouched pastoral scene. He sees the firing ranges of Salisbury Plain, a massive military zone.
And the highway.
And the highway, where brightly colored trucks and cars look like these ephemeral, frantic little toys buzzing around the base of these ancient hills.
So the walker gets this illusion of emptiness or solitude, but that feeling is immediately betrayed.
It's revealed to be constantly surrounded by the machinery of the state and modern commerce. The solitude is conditional, and the deeper you look, the more apparent deep history becomes. etched into the earth itself.
The landscape isn't hiding its past.
No, you just need to know how to read the scars.
So what are those scars? What specific details did the writer notice that revealed this hidden depth of time?
The signs of extremely deep human activity are everywhere on the steep slopes. He observes these lines and stripes like wheels, which suggest fortifications or, evidence of continuous aggressive tilling that went on for many consecutive years a long time ago.
Wow.
And later, when he's walking the valley droveway, he notices these faint but visible ruts of old coach or wagon wheels appearing in the growing cornfields.
So the path he's on was once much more significant.
It indicates that the simple track he was walking was once a much wider, long-disappeared road to Salisbury, probably needed because of how miserably muddy the valley floor always was before modern drainage. The past isn't just buried, it's literally written on the surface of the fields, constantly being revealed and then erased by agriculture.
The detail about the road is so powerful. It shows that human activity, ancient or modern, is what defines the topography. But just as the ancient world left its scars, the more recent past, the last century, is decaying just as fast.
Oh, absolutely. The valley floor is just littered with what you could call modern ruins. The sources list these precise remnants. There are these flat, shallow, gray boxes that were abandoned beehives, now just unexplained and mysterious out in the open.
Suggesting a failed attempt at local production.
Exactly. And the old traditional agricultural methods are visibly decomposing right in front of him.
Like the old hayrick.
Right. There's this old hayrick which had been meticulously stacked into a cottage shape and covered with black plastic sheeting to preserve it. But now it's failing. It's decaying, turning to black, moldering manure.
So it's a slow, physical dissolution of a traditional farm structure.
It was carefully cut one summer, baled, and now it's just returning to the earth, a relic of a pre-industrial technique.
And the structures that replace them, they illustrate this brutal, fast-paced shift toward industrial efficiency.
The contrast is so stark. The new hay golden, fresh, and sweet-smelling, which is a powerful contrast to the black mud and the moldering hayrick. It's stored in a modern open shed, a prefabricated structure.
Purely functional.
And it even carries the maker's name stamped on the roof, Apex. It's mass-produced, efficient, and totally sterile.
I find that description of the golden hay bales right next to the black, rutted mud so evocative. It makes you realize just how much tradition has been eliminated.
It does. And for the writer, coming from the tropics, where grass is perpetually green, the whole idea of hay-dead stored grass was always this abstract European concept.
And seeing the golden bale stacked high next to that industrial shed and the messy black mud, it finally makes sense of all those literary references he had read.
People sleeping on straw or hay, yeah. The new structures, like the rat-proof galvanized tin barn built at the top of the hill, are deliberately placed to bypass the old valley droveway altogether.
Signaling that the traditional farm life, the one centered in the valley bottom, is technologically and economically finished.
Completely. Even symbols of a more recent history, like the wartime bunker, are just fading into the background.
Just another layer of ruin.
Exactly. The bunker was planted over with sycamores for concealment 25 years before, but the trees still look relatively young, immature. That attempt to hide the machinery of war is now just part of the landscape's continuous stratification of failed human attempts.
The whole area is a testament to constant, relentless flux.
A field of continuous ruins where ancient stones and rusty tin sheds just coexist. The illusion of a static pastoral idyll is completely dissolved the moment you look closely.
So, having established that the landscape is anything but fixed, the narrator then begins to observe the people who inhabit it. And initially, he projects his own idea of perfection, his needed sense of order and permanence onto them.
Oh, absolutely.
And the most powerful early example is the gardener, Jack. He sees Jack as a figure who fit the landscape, a complete rooted remnant of the past.
That initial perception was entirely the narrator's own artistic necessity. It was a fantasy he needed to create order out of his own confusion, his Enigma of Arrival.
So it wasn't real.
Well, it was only much later, when he began the act of writing and synthesis, that he realized Jack was living in the middle of junk, among the ruins of nearly a century, and that this supposed past around his cottage might not have been his own inheritance at all.
So Jack's perceived rootedness wasn't organic. It was entirely a conscious act, a deliberate choice to impose a style onto the chaos around him.
It was an act of profound will in creation. Out of that small piece of earth attached to his farm worker's cottage, Jack created a special land for himself. He was inventing a miniature, deliberate culture, reflecting an internal need for order and purpose.
And we get such fascinating, meticulous details about this self-made world. The sources describe Jack's garden like a medieval village in miniature. What made it feel so structured?
It was obsessively segmented. It reflected a desire for absolute control over his environment. Every component served a specific separate function, reflecting a chosen style.
Friends.
You have the carefully clipped hedge, the beautiful, fastidiously clean flower beds maintained by intense manual labor, and then immediately beside them, the utilitarian, dirty plot for ducks and geese, featuring roughly built sheds and discarded earthenware sinks.
That inclusion of the discarded sinks is key, isn't it? It shows the tension between the ideal and the practical necessity of just using what's available.
Exactly. He wasn't seeking wealth. He was seeking labor and tasks. The fulfillment came not from money, but from the meticulousness of the work itself, the sheer dedication to maintaining this self-imposed order. It's almost a philosophical statement made through horticulture.
And even the modern additions, like the mail-order greenhouse, are bent to this idea of tradition.
It sits there, modern, formal, and new amidst all the surrounding farm debris, and yet it's used to grow over-cultivated flowers. It's a contemporary tool applied to a self-conscious traditional purpose.
It's an enforced, willed idyll.
It is, and that massive effort inevitably takes a physical toll, which the writer starts to observe as Jack declines.
And how is that decline physically symbolized? What does he see?
It's marked by his sickness, symbolized most clearly by the smoke rising from his chimney even in summer, a sign of the cold he felt even when it was warm outside, indicating physical deterioration and chronic illness.
A chilling detail.
And when the narrator finally sees him later, his healthy, rich brown color from years of sun exposure has been replaced by a false, smooth whiteness. His face is described as waxen, a sign of impending mortality, suggesting the intensity of the struggle to maintain that style.
And the moment that entire projected idol is revealed to be fragile and imposed comes through Jack's wife after his death. The writer realizes that Jack's deliberate style, including his insistence on his wife wearing her long hair in a traditional bun,
Suggested he might have been a tyrant, enforcing this traditional life.
it's a shocking moment of clarity.
It is. The minute Jack dies, his wife abandons the garden, the focus of his entire existence. She immediately prepares to leave for a council estate in a nearby town like Amesbury or Salisbury.
And she confesses this to the narrator.
She does. She confesses that the traditional life in the damp, muddy valley was never to her taste. She looked forward to the simplicity of shops and community. The whole system, the garden, the bun, the isolation, it was artificial, maintained solely by Jack's will and physical presence. His death dissolved the entire fantasy.
That is a devastating revelation. It suggests that the most outwardly stable lives are often built on the quiet compromises or, the hidden despair of others.
It does. And the narrative then shifts to the staff of the manor house itself, the Phillipses, who also initially appeared settled, but were, in their own way, just as rootless.
They were town people seeking an escape.
Right. Mrs. Phillips had come to the manor suffering from nerves after working in the pressurized environment of a hospital or a hotel. The isolation was meant to be restorative for her. They looked settled and comfortable living in houses that came with their jobs, but they lacked genuine property or permanent roots.
It was a temporary stability.
They had an almost childlike belief that shelter and work would always be provided for them.
And Mr. Phillips, in particular, played a complex, almost theatrical role as this authoritarian servant, despite being a former male nurse.
His role-playing was tied to his physical strength. He had great shoulders and forearms, used to lifting weights and moving patients, and he brought that physical command to his new role. He projected an irritation and authority in his manner, even when performing simple tasks like calling the other gardener Pitten for tea.
So he maintained the illusion of order around the decaying manor.
Indifferent to its overall decline, as long as his little sphere was under his control.
But that illusion of competence and security shattered when Mr. Phillips died suddenly. And the subsequent need for Mrs. Phillips to conceal the news from the childlike, ill landlord caused immense stress.
It forced her back into the nurse's role without her partner's support. It was a horrific ethical and emotional strain.
She had to manage her own shock and grief while protecting the fragile mental state of her employer.
And the stress manifested immediately and visibly. The narrator notes the thin blue veins and prominent veins at her temples, physical markers of the tension she was under. Her grief was immediately absorbed into the practical tasks of management and this dangerous role-playing.
It shows how precarious her security really was.
It was tied entirely to the existence and strength of her active partner. When he was gone, the job, which had seemed so easy and comfortable, became impossibly hard and fraught with tension.
So we see that whether it's the created style of Jack or the role-playing of the Phillipses, the tranquility of the countryside it's a performance.
It's a performance built upon hidden, personal, and physical toll.
If Jack and the Phillipses represented a traditional life that either failed or was artificially maintained, the next wave of arrivals, the newcomers, Les and Brenda, they represent something else entirely. Raw, restless emotion, and a much more desperate search for freedom.
They came to this picturesque, pinked cottage looking for salvation from the terrors of urban life in places like Bristol or Swindon.
They genuinely believed the country would save them.
That the peace and space would eliminate the pain they felt in the city. They were saved by the job, the source notes, but they were utterly ill-equipped for the demands of the country, and they suffered dumbly.
What do you mean by dumbly?
They just lacked the social or linguistic tools to articulate their emotional pains, their confusion, their humiliations. These pains would work themselves out in their characters alone.
And this raw ignorance clashed directly with the expectations of the country setting. They were seeking secrecy, but became immediately noticeable and harshly judged.
They stood out because of their destructive energy. They immediately began wrecking the garden of this picturesque cottage, not out of malice, but pure ignorance of how to manage the land.
And there were more shocking incidents.
Much more. Their actions led to local cruelties, like the incident of the mutilated bleeding pony, an act of casual, ignorant violence that made them instantly infamous and judged far more harshly than they ever would have been in the anonymity of the city.
That's the irony, isn't it? They sought anonymity and peace, but their inability to navigate the cultural code of the countryside just magnified all their flaws. Brenda, in particular, asserted her identity through a defiant, almost abrasive appearance.
She was determined to embody a certain type of modern female power. She followed contemporary fashions that, ironically, often made her look heavy and ill-proportioned, but the narrator keenly observed that this was how she saw herself. Immensely desirable.
It was a statement of self-worth and ambition.
Absolutely. And her sunbathing in the literal wreck of their garden was an act of personal sexual assertion.
An intense restlessness.
A feeling that she owed this kind of focused attention to her own perceived beauty and sexual energy. This energy was, in effect, her only source of capital and her sole path to opportunity and escape.
Which leads to her involvement with Michael Allen, the central heating contractor, and this devastating cycle of servitude and escape.
She briefly found a temporary freedom, the run of the Little Wild estate, when the Phillipses were away, acting as a part-time servant in the manor grounds. But that wasn't enough.
Her impulsive flight to Italy with Michael Allen
Resulted in him kicking her out, forcing her back to the valley, defeated.
and the insight into her background, which comes from her sister, is crucial here. It reveals this cycle of disappointment is generational.
Yes. Her sister revealed the deeper familial pain. Their father, a simple serviceman, had a fleeting moment of inspiration during the war that led to a burst of success and ambition.
And this created massive, disappointed hopes for the family.
Hopes that could never be fulfilled in their normal lives. So the pink-thatched cottage was never salvation. It was merely another temporary shelter in a long line of transient homes. The pursuit of freedom for people like Brenda is often just a continuation of a familial or social cycle of failed aspiration.
Let's shift to the new gardener, Pitton, who offers such a powerful contrast to Jack. Where Jack created tradition, Pitton embodied a modern, professional discipline.
Pitton was precise, organized, and utterly non-sentimental. He understood that his labor was often pointless, like cleaning the hidden garden only to have the manor close it up again, but he needed that external validation.
The key here is that Pitton required an external country gentleman idea to maintain his pride.
Exactly. To resist what he perceived as degeneracy or the chaos of his situation.
And how did he express that external fantasy?
Through disciplined consumption and image. He wore expensive clothes, bought from a specific high-end outfitter in Salisbury. He boasted about his hi-fi system. He performed his labor with a professional pride that was entirely detached from the actual value of the outcome.
He worked against the wilderness.
Knowing his efforts would eventually be erased, but the process maintained his self-concept.
The narrator describes Pitton's constant need to maintain this distance from being merely a paid laborer. And this need for external validation came to a theatrical head during the pink champagne revelation.
Ah, yes. This is one of the most revealing anecdotes about the manor's internal life. The landlord, having recovered from his intense acedia, that is, a profound spiritual weariness or listlessness, chose to celebrate.
Acedia. That's a crucial word here.
It describes a debilitating mental and spiritual exhaustion, often associated with a privileged lack of purpose. The landlord, shaking off this lethargy, celebrated his return to vitality by feeding Pitton pink champagne at 10 in the morning.
A completely ridiculous, extravagant performance.
It was a deliberate performance by the employer, a man maintaining his own sense of romantic, privileged style of before the deluge. And Pitton was absolutely slain, utterly flattened by the gesture because it broke the necessary professional boundary.
But the story, later stored up and told by the landlord of visitors, showed that even the employer relies on that past narrative and the performance of patronage.
Right. And Pitton's final passionate reaction when his house was to be sold revealed the deep emotional investment beneath his professional facade. His pride he had cultivated was completely exposed when his security was threatened. His professional mask just dropped.
And the sheer passionate anger he exhibited took him to a depth of feeling he was not prepared for.
It suggested how fragile his constructed self-concept really was. For these workers, their home, however temporary, was their dignity.
The complexity continues with Bray, the car hire man, a local who was fiercely independent, but also deeply defined by service and a chameleon nature.
Bray is a fascinating study in contradiction. He was a mixture of high conservatism and wild republicanism. His fierce independence was symbolized by his deliberate acts of social offense, like turning the front of his cottage into a paved, oil-stained mechanic's yard, explicitly to annoy his neighbor, Pitton.
The man who valued traditional appearances so much.
Exactly.
But if he was fiercely independent, why did he have such a fluid personality, often using different accents and registers?
That's the tension. His fluid personality suggested the deep instability of a servant, someone molded by generations of needing to please and adapt to the gentry, lacking a fixed internal model of self. He was always a stranger to himself, reflecting the narrator's own earlier state of being an outsider trying to fit in.
So his independence was a rebellion against the role he was forced to play.
But the need to adapt remained ingrained.
Yet, Bray found community and purpose, not in tradition or work, but through a new, deeply personal religious faith centered on a healer and regular meetings.
This was a religion of radical solace. It provided a community for people wounded in their minds and hearts, those for whom the material world, work, family, social expectation had proved too much.
And this quest for emotional healing linked him to a woman he found stranded at Salisbury railway station.
A woman without money or a ticket. He felt compelled to help her, seeing in her aggression and neediness an attraction, perhaps recognizing a shared spiritual brokenness.
And his wife, Mrs. Bray, provided this necessary, bitter counter-narrative to his newfound spiritual serenity. She was focused entirely on mundane, material practicalities.
Her rage was directed at his new piety, which she saw as impractical and wasteful. Specifically, she was furious about his ritual of constantly emptying the deep freeze for the shared meals at the religious meetings.
For Bray, the deep freeze, full of food, represented a new ritual of plenty.
It was a symbol of their collective harvest and generosity, spiritual sharing.
But for Mrs. Bray, it was the exact opposite.
Yes. For her, the deep freeze was the ultimate symbol of security. She preferred to hoard, to build it up and never touch it. It reflected a deeper ancestral anxiety about scarcity and the need for preparedness.
So this small domestic detail, the fight over the deep freeze, highlights two fundamentally different approaches to life.
One seeking spiritual fulfillment through communal generosity, the other clinging desperately to material security against the ever-present threat of hunger and poverty.
What a fantastic contrast. These character studies show that even in the quietest valley, life is driven by these immense, often painful, internal and external forces.
And the complexity of these Wiltshire observations, Jack's tyranny, Brenda's desperate flight, Bray's spiritual quest, it's all inextricably linked to the narrator's own decades-long journey from Trinidad and his early, painful, failed attempts to become a writer in London.
Right. This process of observation is self-reflection.
He arrived in London in 1950 full of ambition, having won a scholarship to Oxford, but he found himself armed only with abstract learning. He felt profoundly misplaced.
He felt he had arrived too late.
He was expecting the world of Dickens, a romanticized, established literary setting, but he found only overwhelming urban sprawl, strangeness, and crushing loneliness. His learning, derived from books, was useless against the concrete reality of metropolitan life.
And his early writing attempts were defined by this internal conflict. He was trying to be a writer of sophisticated, epic themes while suppressing the pain of his immediate lived experience.
He was guilty of self-deception and seeking an artificial elegance. He suppressed deeply painful and humiliating experiences. For example, the experience of being overcharged by the airport taxi driver, or his nervous, awkward offering of bananas to a complete stranger on the plane. These immediate, anxious moments were too raw to record.
So instead, he aspired to the grand, world-weary narrative of a seasoned traveler.
Trying to be like Somerset Maugham, he wrote knowing, epic pieces, like one called Gelenite, that projected sophistication but suppressed his true reality, his anxiety, and his sense of shame.
He was too busy aspiring to be a particular type of successful writer to record what was actually happening to him. That suppression of reality made his early work dishonest.
Absolutely, and nothing exposed his vulnerability and the true nature of the world's perception of him more sharply than the incident on the SS Columbia crossing the Atlantic.
This detail is brutal. He was given a cabin to share, and another passenger, a Negro man, was brought in.
Yes. The Negro man immediately rejected the shared cabin, raising his voice and stating, "It's because I'm colored you're putting me here with him." This comment was a profound, immediate shock.
To the narrator.
To the narrator. He realized that with all his Oxford scholarship, all his ambition, all his cosmopolitan aspiration, he had only been given a ghetto privilege, a status that mocked everything he was trying to achieve.
The shame must have been immense. To be lumped together and publicly rejected in a way that reduced his entire intellectual and cultural ambition to a single category.
It was devastating. He immediately edited the incident out of his diary because it did not fit his grand, aloof, writerly personality. It was a confrontation with reality he just wasn't ready to face.
He spent years running from that vulnerability.
He did.
The actual breakthrough, the true illumination, only came 5 years after his arrival in England, when he realized the solution wasn't finding an epic theme, but embracing the small, specific, concrete reality he had left behind.
It was a sudden, seismic realization. His true material lay in the immediate street life of Port of Spain, Trinidad, the worlds I contained within myself. His subject was the small world he knew, the seemingly insignificant details, what he termed flotsam.
And this shift from abstract, grand themes to concrete, specific observation provided the self-knowledge and curiosity he had been lacking.
It allowed him to define himself as a man and a writer who was recording reality, not running from it.
And this sense of material and theme then fed directly back into his ability to understand the English landscape he was now inhabiting in Wiltshire. He started to see the valley not as a strange, alien place, but through the lens of art and memory.
Exactly. His ability to observe the valley developed in parallel with his artistic self-discovery. He found that E.H. Shepard's illustrations for The Wind in the Willows gave physical reality and history to the gypsy caravan he saw on the droveway.
And more profoundly.
More profoundly, observing the water meadows allowed him to abolish the historical distance between the present moment and the celebrated art of the past.
The past became comprehensible, accessible, not abstract. He felt the presence of the painter, Constable, seemed as near and contemporary as what he made us now see.
He felt as if Constable had just put down his brush to paint that precise scene. The act of painting and the object being painted were collapsing into the same moment of physical reality. This fusion of art, memory, and physical landscape gave him the confidence to use the English countryside as a setting for universal truths about change and arrival.
And finally, the actual conceptual framework for the book he would write about his arrival, The Enigma of Arrival, came from the most unexpected source, a small booklet he found in his cottage.
A paperback booklet on the early surrealist paintings of Giorgio de Chirico. Chirico's work, with its arbitrary assemblages of unrelated motifs, aqueducts next to trains, arcades next to classical statues, and their easy mystery, suggested the fragmented, strange reality of his own life journey.
So the painting suggested the title, the concept, and the emotional architecture.
It did. The idea of the ship's story, the Enigma of Arrival, carried the full weight of his emotional burden, his long spiritual weariness, and his search for release. It linked the fragmented, strange world he saw in the paintings, the juxtaposition of past and present, industry and ruin, to his own personal journey from the tropics to this strange, old Wiltshire Valley. The puzzle of his own existence found its artistic analogy in surrealism.
This entire framework, built on decades of displacement and observation, required a final, visceral confrontation with mortality and grief before it could be fully synthesized into art.
Yes, the idea of constant flux moves from an intellectual concept to a gut-wrenching personal reality.
The narrator's second, serious illness in England, a severe choking fit near Jack's yard, resolving into what he called battle fatigue, was a decisive transition. It pushed him irrevocably into middle age.
It confirmed that energy and action were no longer absolutely at his command.
And this personal sickness made the observed changes in the valley more bearable, didn't it? He realized that if his own body was in flux, everything else must be too.
Exactly. He had to intellectually train himself not to feel grief for things like the two giant aspens snapping like twigs in a gale or the slow decay of the manor. He recognized flux as the natural state of existence. But that intellectual detachment was violently shattered by the news of the brain hemorrhage and death of his younger sister, Sati, back in Trinidad.
This forced a collision of worlds: the cosmopolitan writer in Wiltshire and his family legacy and grief in the Caribbean.
Sati was 7 weeks short of her 16th birthday when he had left. She was now a grown, married woman who had lived through the chaos of Trinidad's political changes and oil boom. He had to confront a life he hadn't shared, a profound missing piece of his own history.
And he returned for the subsequent Hindu ritual.
A ceremony complementary to the cremation. And the description of the ritual powerfully highlights the disconnect between the traditional sanctities and the new suburban life the family now inhabited.
The ceremony, led by his cousin who was a pundit, was strange and jarring in the suburban setting.
It was performed on a shallow earth altar laid out on the terrazzo of the veranda of the house, surrounded by modern fixtures. This was technically his family's tradition, but it felt foreign to him now, an attempt to leave nothing undone to honor the dead fully.
And the pundit, asserting himself in this vulnerable family moment, also carried his own historical baggage within the family.
He was a heavy six-footer relation from the branch of the family that despised the narrator's father's more reformist views. He was asserting the old orthodox ways. This tension culminated when the pundit attempted to interpret the concept of reincarnation for the grieving family.
And what was the effect of that interpretation?
Well, when Sati's young son asked if she would come back and her husband desperately asked if they would be together again, the pundit delivered a brutal intellectual interpretation of reincarnation. But you wouldn't know it as her.
Wow.
It reduced the grieving husband to absolute despair. The abstract faith, the promise of eternity, offered no comfort in the face of unique, personal, irreplaceable loss. The narrator recognized that in the face of death, philosophy often fails.
But for the narrator, this event, this real grief replacing his long-standing abstract melancholy, was deeply transformative. He spent time concentrating on Sati's unique, singular life, and he felt purged.
It was the ultimate synthesis. The intellectual vacancy he had experienced for years was filled by profound human sorrow. This event showed him life and man as the mystery, the true religion of men, the grief and the glory. It was the essential knowledge he needed, that human love, life, and loss are the core subject, not abstract history or grand themes.
And this realization leads to his final reflection on history, lineage, and home. The world is defined by constant change, yet the human search for meaning is constant.
He reflects on the immense historical forces that shaped his family, the migration from India, the history of slavery, colonization, and the recent chaos of oil wealth in Trinidad. He acknowledges that every generation is taken further away from their inherited sanctities.
Trinidad itself, remade by oil money and illegal immigrants, was no longer his in the way it had been.
His family had come out of the nightmare of poverty and subjugation, and there was no going back. There was nowhere else to go but forward into the remaking of the world.
This complex understanding that the world is in constant painful motion, yet human needs persist, finally allowed him to end his drafts and hesitations in Wiltshire.
His arrival, the Enigma, was solved by the acceptance of change and grief. Between October 1984 and April 1986, this new clarity allowed him to write very fast about the life he had observed, about Jack and his garden, synthesizing his entire life journey, his Trinidadian past, and his observations of flux in England into true, completed art.
The journey that began in 1950, defined by the challenge of the SS Columbia and the shame of suppressed reality, was finally completed in the Wiltshire Valley.
It really was.
This entire deep dive reveals that the pastoral idyll of the English countryside is not a fixed haven of stability, but merely another plateau of light, constantly threatened by the troughs of historical darkness and personal struggle.
The central, unifying insight is the relentlessness of change. All perceived stability is temporary, whether it's a centuries-old driveway, a man's meticulously maintained garden, or a writer's state of mind. We saw the inevitable decay of things physical, the manor buildings, the aspen snapping, the hayrick turning to manure.
Yet, the human constant persists beneath the surface of this decay. Though the settings change, human needs endure across centuries and continents. The need for a story to explain oneself, like Pitton did.
For dignity, for fulfillment in labor, like Jack.
For a desperate, sometimes frantic escape from crushing reality, like Brenda. The cycle of servitude, ambition, and adaptation continues in new, modern forms, whether it's Bray driving tourists or Mrs. Phillips managing her grief.
And this brings us to the final, necessary irony of the writer's journey, one that he himself confronted with real shame. After solving his own Enigma of Arrival, the narrator became the agent of destruction for someone else's past.
He left the manor and moved to renovate the shepherd's cottages, remodeling them completely. In doing so, he changed the entrance and did away with half of the building where an old lady's grandfather had lived.
So when the old woman visited the lane, she no longer recognized her past home. The perfection, the security, and the memory of her lineage were erased by the narrator's creative act of establishing his own stability.
He was, as the source notes, embarrassed to have destroyed or spoiled the past for the old lady.
A powerful moment of self-awareness.
It forces a powerful final question for you, the listener, to consider. If we are all constantly in flux, arriving in new places, creating our second lives, and building our sense of certainty, whose history and whose quiet perfection are we, the new arrivals, inevitably destroying in the process of building our own home?